Hunter, how are you? Happy Tuesday. Happy Pride.
Happy Tuesday. What is a beautiful day to be prideful and happy on this day with you. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. A little, I've been Pride Month is always a very busy month for obvious reasons. So I've been doing a little bit of traveling, but I'm happy to be back home, settled,
Okay.
and living. So God bless it.
And where is home for you?
Washington, our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. So I don't live too far from the capital. Here in DC. So I'm happy to be home. I was in New York this past weekend, where I was part of the NYC Prides. They kicked off their celebration on Friday with a rally, on Saturday with a rally rather, and then on Sunday they had a Pride brunch, and I was proud to host that. And now I'm back home.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so I read a little bit about your bio, but I'd love to hear more about you, a little bit about your background, maybe your journey of getting to all these amazing places that you are now in your life. So tell me about, let's take us back in time a little bit, Richard.
Yeah, let's take we're going to Mr. Rogers' Land of Make Believe, right?
Exactly. I'm going to put on my little sweater. So of course you bring that up.
But no, listen, I got to tell you, I think it's so interesting as I think about my life now, that I feel like life is a journey and life prepares you for all the things. And so when I sort of take my mind backwards, my mom was a single mother, registered nurse. So I spent a lot of time sort of being raised in a hospital, and also being raised by a whole bunch of healthcare professionals. And I think what you learn when you are amongst or in the presence of these heroes, right? They were heroes way before COVID-19, is this ideal to put empathy before sympathy, right? And to not, and also to sort of approach your work with a little less judgment and a little bit more, well, let me just care about the person that's in front of me. And the way you always think about it is, when is the emergency room the busiest? And the emergency room is the busiest between Thanksgiving and Christmas. It's usually because somebody decides that they're going to get on a ladder and string up lights on their roof instead of paying someone to do it, or somebody decides they're going to fry a turkey without reading the instructions correctly. And the natural inclination, like you just did right there, Hunter, is to laugh about that. But when they go to the emergency room, instead of laughing at many of our fellow neighbors' stupidity, these healthcare professionals sort of ask them, how's your pain?
Yeah.
What's going on? What happened? And how can we make it better? And how can, most of the time they always say, we're going to try everything to help you feel better, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. And so growing up in that environment has sort of honed my ability to tell really good stories by focusing in and humanizing the person and focusing less on their circumstances. And so that's sort of what brings me to the work that I do, whether it's on the Fox News channel, whether it's my writing at Forbes magazine, where I do long form features, or whether it's my advocacy work. It's all about finding people where they are and taking them to where you need them to be.
I love that. I also gave a little chuckle because I too have taken my partner to the emergency room on a holiday. But it was, it sounds like it would be a really dramatic story because it was on 4th of July. He cut his hand trying to cut an avocado.
Oh. and that's what cutting boards are for. But once again, the nurse didn't say that to him.
No, they were very nice. I was sitting right next to him during the whole process, and they were very kind. And actually, this nurse had the exact same scar on the same hand. It was actually quite wild. But they, like you said, they brought this level of empathy to the conversation. That's really interesting to hear about your own background in that. Can you talk to me about how, so you've learned at a very early age to hone, to foster, to embrace your level of empathy before sympathy, as you said. How do you use your voice to advocate for change on these different platforms and mediums? Because some of them have wildly different audiences, different.
Listen, I think that's a great question. And I think to your point there, I try to meet the person where they are, right? Even in my own, even in our, and as people, as part of the LGBTQIA community, whether you're coming out or you're inviting people in to share in your story, part of that coming out experience, while it's full of flutters and nerves and butterflies and anger and pain and trauma, there's also what you find is about the people that you love the most, you give a little bit of grace, right? And that grace, that little, I call it God's 7 seconds of grace in conversation, right? That is the magic of really good storytelling. I'm going to find out where you are, and I'm going to take you to where I need you to be, whether that's using somebody's story to do it, or as a vehicle, or it's me using my own story to do it, or it's me talking about a policy position and saying, hey, look, before I get into the policy and the mechanics of the policy, let's actually talk about where you are on this journey, where you might be on this journey, and where are some of the connecting points from that we can utilize to take you on this train moving forward? Is there a little bit of education I can give you? Is a little bit of experiential learning I can give you in 3 or 4 or 5 minutes or in 2,000 words that will help you see, oh, I'm connected to that person. Oh, I see something familiar with that person. Oh, I understand where that person's coming from. And if you do just a little bit of that, I think what you'll find oftentimes, the people are more willing to hear your policy position. People are more willing to hear what you're advocating for. And oftentimes, while they might not agree with you, what you don't necessarily, it's not all the time in this level in advocacy we want agreement. We want acknowledgement more so than agreement. Acknowledge that I exist. Acknowledge that my presence matters. Acknowledge that I'm a human, right? If you can do that, then it's hard for you to pass policies or to write bills. And I think as we talk about the 400 and some odd bills moving in various state legislatures, it's hard for you to write a bill if I'm a real person. It's hard for you to persecute me if I'm a real person. And to take it back to the hospital setting, there's a difference when a medical professional identifies the person as, oh, that's the arm pain in bed 2, or that's the guy who cut his hand on the avocado in bed 4, and more so saying, that's Mr. Eric, that's Miss Lisa. And in conferring dignity upon them, right, and in giving them a name, right, and making them human and not talking about their ailment, right, you can empathize with it, but you also create this level of humanity. And notice, I always tell people, notice when things are going in the opposite direction. So when you see rights being taken away, when you see oppression happening at its highest levels, whether you go back to Hitler's Germany, or you go back to Rwanda, or you go back to any of these stories, even if you go back to enslavement here in America, as we just celebrated Juneteenth, the first thing that happens is they make the individuals that they're trying to oppress, they take away their humanity, slowly but surely, right? So in the case of Nazi Germany, they blamed them for all the problems. They started putting out propaganda saying that they're less human, they're less deserving of the things that a human can have or a human should access. In enslavement, people of color aren't human, they're closer to animals. Like there's literally charts that charted where they were. And when you put that chart there and you take their humanity away, and you start to, if we all start at 100 and you take them down to 50, or you take them down to 94, the moment you start to trickle down their humanity, it's easy to do things to a group of people without thinking about it.
Yeah, it's in, like you said, in all of those examples, just horrific consequences and people going along with it because they were accepting that these people were less than, they were not
Absolutely.
human. Yeah. And I love what you said about the opposite about that. I'm going to put this on a post-it in my room, is conferring dignity upon people. That is just chef's kiss of like wisdom.
Oh,
You need to think about on a regular basis. Like, that can be in small ways of like, maybe someone that's losing their temper around me, like, how can I confer dignity upon this person before me? And also, I think it's good advice for us socially to like always be doing that whenever possible.
Well, Hunter, let's just take that example that you just used of somebody losing it in a grocery store, somebody losing it at a store at a sales clerk, or somebody losing it in traffic. When I encounter those situations, just like when I encounter somebody who's reading my work on Forbes or who's watching me on Fox, well, is there a reason? Was there some precipitating events prior to me seeing them having this really bad moment, right, that I'm not taking into account when I decide to make a snap judgment about that person, right? Did something happen before? Did they just lose a parent, right? There's so many different things that could have happened before that got them to the moment where we've seen their worst of it. And I'll tell you, a couple years ago, I self-financed a pilot, and it was called 24 Hours in America. And as part of the pilot, we spent a life in an American. And I was really keen, this was before George Floyd, the heinous murder of George Floyd. I was really keen on spending 24 hours with a police officer. And my producers were like, why a police officer? I'm like, one, I think that there's some misunderstanding about the profession, but two, I have real questions about the decisions that they make and why they make them. And one of the things that the police officer said to me, said a couple of things, but one thing that she was on the force for 3 years, what she said to me at the beginning, and it really, one of the first things she said, she's like, when you encounter more, 9 times out of 10, when you're having an encounter with me, you're probably having a really, really bad day. You're probably having one of the worst days of your life
Mm.
in that moment. And she's like, and so when I go to a call, I oftentimes remember that the person on the other side of this event is having the worst day of their life. And I was
Wow.
like, wow, I never thought about it from that perspective. Not saying that we don't need to be reforming police, but also walking into it with, when you see somebody having the worst day of their life, can you assume better from them? And should we have a police, should we have a criminal justice system that takes into account the fact that the moment that I'm encountering you, right, and I'm making an arrest or I'm giving you a penalty, you're likely having the worst day of your life, and it might not be a shining example of who you reflect as a person. And I think that's really important, especially as we think, and to make that connection to what I think this Pride Month represents, and the mantra, and I learned this last week, of New York Pride, which they kicked off on Friday, and like I said, their parade is happening this weekend, is solidarity through strength. And why their sort of motto spoke to me in a real way is that's part of this journey ahead for the LGBTQIA movement. One is we've got to deal with the stories that exist in our own space. We've got to deal with the fact that there is some disconnect between LGBTQ folks of color who are having their own struggles versus LGBTQ folks who might be white Americans, and how do we make those bonds stronger? Number one. Number two, as part of our fight back against many of the legislation sort of going into place all across the country, is figuring out who's in this fight with us, and how do we make partners by seeing each other as human and not what they've told us that we are. And what you find when you do that work is that the intersections are a dead giveaway, right? You think about one of the best authors in American history, James Baldwin, right? And James Baldwin's books are being banned in so many states, but James Baldwin shows up at the intersection. His books are being banned because he's Black, but his books are also being banned because he talks about LGBTQIA liberation. So why can't the two groups that live at this intersection of Baldwin say, hey, listen, we're in this battle together, and our humanities are so connected that if we don't choose to fight together, then the results of it might mean that we lose together.
Mm-hmm. I'm really fascinated by what you were saying earlier too about, okay, so we have these intersections, and we need to be able to humanize the people before the policy could be made. And you've talked about your great storytelling. For folks that are interested in doing this, what are effective approaches to storytelling that you would recommend, that like, oh, okay, Hunter, this is how, if you want to get that done, I would suggest you try this and this and this.
Oh, that's such a good question, Hunter. Now, I'm blessed that outside of my work at Fox at Forbes, I'm a features writer. So as a features writer, you're blessed with the ability to, I tell people all the time, I fall in these miniature love affairs with my stories, right? So I'm in love, like for a case in point, I think where it shows up here perfectly is, I mean, some people I'm in love. I mean, there's some people I just genuinely like, right? But there's some folks that I write about. Last Pride, I wrote, and I probably should repost this story. I wrote about the founders of Black Gay Pride. And Black Gay Pride is now celebrating its 30, I think we're under 33rd year. And Ernest Hopkins was 3 founders of Black Gay Pride. Ernest Hopkins is one of them. He's still alive. I got a chance to sit down and talk to him about the journey of a movement. And he talks about it in such a rich way where he doesn't even acknowledge the blessing that he created, right? 30 years ago, the first Pride was next to Howard University in our nation's capital. 800 people showed up. And the ideal behind Black Pride at the time was, we're going to have some drinks, we're going to play some music, and we're going to raise money for LGBTQIA folks of color who were struggling with HIV at the time, and they were literally dying. And the stories they talking about this ideal of not being human, is they talked about how folks who were dying of HIV, their family wouldn't go pick them up at the crematorium. So the ideal is like, we would go pick up their ashes, right? And we would carry their ashes with us, or we would bury their ashes. And then we figure out like, we had to help them pay for medical care. Today, in our nation's capital, with sort of Black Pride being the marquee, DC Black Pride being the marquee of the prides, 80,000 people attend Pride here in our nation's capital, just for Black Pride on Memorial Weekend every year. So to go from 800 to 80,000, that's like a 100 plus times 100 increase. And so I asked Ernest, do you even think about it like that? And he's like, no, we were just trying to solve a problem. But in the ideal of them trying to solve a problem, they humanize all those 800 people. And when you hear the stories that he tells, like at the time, if you were a federal employee and you worked for the federal government and you were Black and you were gay and you lived in the nation's capital, you were very afraid of coming to Pride because the ideal of you being gay could have cost you your federal job because there wasn't any protections for it at that moment. And so to know that we're 80,000 strong now speaks to the value in the work, but also in celebrating ourselves, right? In conferring dignity upon ourselves, we were able to see the fight was more universal. And the fight was, hey, listen, we're in this together, we're in this boat together. And at the same time, it also it created a situation for, or a lane for allies to say, well, I don't really understand it, but I know someone. And because I know someone, I'm now in the fight. And I've even seen this in my own personal family, right? When I tell my own story, I have family members who would not have been an advocate. They might not have, put an HRC sticker on their car, but now that they know that I'm in it, they're like, well, no, I know somebody in this. So at minimum, in my life, I'm going to choose to be an advocate. I'm going to choose to be an like you said, the anti-racist, an anti-homophobic person because I know someone. And that's why those stories are so important, right? Because when they know, even if it might not be my story, if I have a family member that hears another story of somebody who lives in community, they're like, well, I know a cousin who lives in community, and because I know a cousin, I'm now connected. So now what am I able to do? And in the storytelling that I do, I really just try to uplift people who are doing the work, and people can connect to them, connect to whether they're connecting them professionally, whether you connect to them personally, whether you connect to them just because they're a human or you're a human, or whether you connect to them because y'all have shared, somebody's watching this and their name is Ernest as well, right? Whatever the connection might be, use whatever connection you can find to make that little thin line, or that little one-lane road, little one-lane highway, I like to call it. And then from there you can build a whole expressway, but it takes one lane first of like, how do I get to you? And how do I make you see this person as a human, whether they're non-binary, whether they're transgendered, whether they're gay, whether they're bisexual, whether they're lesbian, whether they're a person of color, whether they're Caucasian. Like, how do I see you? How do I get a road connected to you? And then how do I turn that road into a highway to make you an advocate and an ally?
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love that. I'm going to keep that, Richard. So
keep away.
Yeah, we gotta give it away to keep it, right?
Exactly.
So let's shift gears a little bit. You just mentioned how you are a person who wants to uplift people. So let's talk about the younger generation. So what do you think is missing in the media or corporations, in their current messaging to millennials and Gen Z around policy issues, and especially as it pertains to the LGBTQIA plus atmosphere?
I love that question, Hunter. First, let me say this. I can only speak for myself. I mean, I knew when I was a lot younger that of where I sort of sat on the acronym, but I didn't make that sort of. And I listen. I don't think I'm a big believer now of inviting in versus rather than coming out. You invite people to sharing your story rather than constantly coming out and outing yourself over and over again. But I say all that to say, I mean, for me, it was in my 20s. When I see these young people who are, and at that point in time, I was paying all my own bills. I was paying my own bills. I was paying my own rent. So me coming out, yes, I dealt with backlash, but there's not much you can do to me if I'm financially independent as a family member, right? And so as I live now, I see these young people making these brave choices at 12, 13, 14, going to school board meetings, showing up at protests, organizing walkouts at their school.
Yeah,
it makes me feel proud, but their bravery is like, I get encouragement from that energy, right? Like, these kids are braver than me. And they're willing to put it all on the line at such a young age. And so I think for the first thing is I want to acknowledge that. I think the second thing is as we move into, and I think, look, I think as we celebrate Pride, right? And we, celebrate the joy and the safe space that Pride creates. I remember my first Black Pride, I remember my first Capital Pride. And I think it's really important to also remember who the audience is. Remember that in many of these state legislatures, we're talking to, the average age of the United States Congress, the average age of the United States Senate today, the people passing laws are 67 years old. That's the average, like that's the mean. And the median is 67.5, I think, is the actual age. And you take that down to a state legislature, I'm sure you're going to get, you might, if you're lucky, you'll find a state legislature where the average age is 60 or 58 or 59. But that actually matters, right? It's easy. They don't understand. They're not part of the TikTok generation. They weren't a generation that was able to get information very quickly. I mean, even in my own, I was blessed that, you know, half my life I had social media, for the other half of my life I didn't. And I'm not that old. I'm only 36. But as a result of that, we have to remember that in this fight for equality, we have to remember that some of, if we model our fight after the fights that came before. So if you remember that Pride started out as a protest, right, with Marsha P. Johnson and the brave LGBTQIA folks at the Stonewall. The Stonewall wasn't a one night thing, right? It was constant, consistent pressure to change the laws in New York City. And if we use them as our guide, or even if we use LGBTQ leader Bayard Rustin, right, who the organizer of the March on Washington, they just didn't wake up one day and say, we're going to take hundreds of thousands of people and bring them to the mall. It was a constant, persistent struggle that lasted a number of decades. I'm not saying that our fight for equality now should last a number of decades. What I'm using that to say is that we've got to give a little grace, and we've also got to remember that this is not a short-term fight, right? And as we see many of these rights being rolled back, as we see many of these laws being pushed, remember, this is a long-term fight. You have to be in it for the long haul. Pack a granola bar, all right? Pack your good-fitting shoes, right? And say, we're here for a minute. We're in this fight for a minute, and we're not going anywhere. So we're going to be here. And while we're here, and while we're sitting next to you, and while we're outside protesting, instead of meeting the person with this, like, you're taking our rights away, so we should have this righteous indignation. Yes, but we should also be like, and let me tell you a little bit about me. My name is Richard. Here's where I went to high school. Here's my story. My mom is a nurse, right? And be able, both my parents are immigrants to this country. So I'm just as much human. I'm just as much of America. I look just like America, like you do, right? And the more we tell that story, that's really the weapon. That's the powerfulest tool that we have in this fight, is to constantly tell our stories. And over time, what you're going to see happen is our story is going to connect with people, or more people are going to be brave enough to share their stories. And the more stories we share, the more work we do, the more we begin to educate people and break down the misnomers. Because what we live in an era of misinformation. Like when you see I mean, I encountered somebody who got into my DMs talking about like groomers, like, you're an LGBT groomer, and I'm like, I don't even know what that means. So what are you? And I asked them to define these terms. Like, what does an LGBTQ groomer mean? And instead of meeting it with this, like, you're crazy, my response was, well, when I was in high school and I was in middle school, I was looking in books and I was trying to find myself in history. And I mean, I wasn't in high school at a time where they were banning history, but I didn't learn about Rustin or Stonewall until I got to college. And what a world of difference it would have made if Rustin was in my history book. What a world of difference it would have made if the Stonewall riots was in my history book, where I saw myself in history reflected as a powerful, brave, and bold individual. And then use that and then that's the way we move forward. It's not about, yes, you are erasing history, but understand what happens when you take people who look like me or who love like me out of history. Then you give me nothing to aspire to. You give me nothing to visualize. But we have to consistently share our stories so people realize it. And the person that I ended up getting into a conversation with on Instagram, he's like, wow, I never understood that. Thank you for sharing this. Like, we went from being, you're a groomer, to, oh, okay, I see what you're saying now. And so it's like, but it takes I'm not saying it's easy work, right? It's like it's like being what do they call it? Like the people who take the bombs apart. Like, you have to go in there and try to take this bomb apart before it explodes.
Yeah, the bomb squad.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not easy work. And it's not, I'm not going to sit here tell everybody it's easy. It's painful work. It's traumatic work, but it's necessary work in order for us to continue to be advocates for ourselves. And everybody plays a role. You need storytellers, you need organizers, you need protesters, you need all those different people showing up in different ways. You need folks who make the brave choice to run for office. You need folks who decide to plan their local pride. You need the people who own the clubs that give us safe places. You need the DJs and the musical illustrators that play in those clubs that bring us joy. All of us play an intricate part. You need bartenders. You need all those things. You need all the things, right? And my job is that I'm a storyteller, and this is what I do.
Yeah, I love that. So like you, I spent half my life without social media and then the other half with it. Now I'm trying to maybe get a little less in my life sometimes, there's that balance. But for folks that are of the younger generation who know only social media as part of their life and are getting their news and their information that way, what mediums should groups use to engage with generations in these conversations? How do legacy programs connect with these generations that'll be like, oh, my parents watch that,
I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think you have to continue having this conversation on legacy platforms, because as we all know, legacy platforms will turn into viral clips on social media platforms. So that's thing one. And I think two, there has to be an engagement on some of these, digital platforms to be like, hey, here's what's happening. But we also have to remember that Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Spill, they're not places. They're not real places, right? And that's the real thing to remember. When I first started out on TV, Hunter, I got to tell you, one of my mentors said to me, don't ever read the comments. She's like, if you get into your comments, what you'll find is a whole bunch of cyber bullies who live behind computer screens who have nothing better to do with their lives. And I never really understood it until I realized the time it took for somebody to, like, the time it takes for you to write a mean comment on somebody's page, or the time it takes for you to see me on air, find me, because likely you're not following me, find me on air, see me on air, find me on social media, and then write me, call me the F word, call me the N word, call me a horrible person, call me a groomer. The amount of time it takes to do that, most folks don't have it. Most busy people do not have that much time in their day. So this is somebody who has nothing better to do than to sit on social media and troll. So you have to, and that's why I'm saying it's not a real place, right? It's a place where people can share information, but it's not a real place. It's a place that lives in the sky. It's not real. So that requires that if you're a young person and you're watching this and you want to be an advocate, yes, you should operate on these social media platforms, but also take the time to go out and talk to your neighbor, right? And figure out a way, especially if you're part of the LGBTQIA community, right? And you live in a part of the country, and you live in a rural or suburban America, right? If you live in DC or New York or Chicago, you're blessed that you live in a city that sort of, to some extent, respects your humanity. But even in those cities, like in DC, we're dealing with the number of unresolved trans murders where they haven't found the killers yet. So even in these major cities, we have real challenges. But I say all that to say, take the time to have a conversation with your neighbor about your lived experience. Because one, your neighbor's a voter. Two, your neighbor can serve as an ally. Three, your neighbor can write a letter to their legislature. And if there's one or two people that says, hey, listen, I know a kid, or I know a family where where one of their children are transitioning, that might be the difference in how a legislator passes a bill. That might be the one vote that goes from making the bill not as bad as it once was. And I think sometimes we devalue the worth of having a conversation or having a literal one-on-one conversation with somebody. And that's one of the best organizing tools we have, to be like, hey, I think my neighbor might disagree with me, and I'm a young person and I'm brave and I'm transitioning. And so I'm going to go talk to them and tell them my story. And my hope is that I don't need you. Like I said, I don't need you to agree with me. I need you to acknowledge my humanity. I need you to acknowledge that I'm a human and I'm having a human experience. And just like you, my human experience deserves respect. And that respect comes from every avenue, whether it's the legislature, whether it's, the hospital, whether it's the community center, whether it's at the grocery store.
Oh, beautiful. Richard, can you believe it? We're out of time.
That went fast.
That went fast. I'm going to miss you. So please come back. How can folks?
Anytime.
I know you're on all the socials. Where can folks find you?
Listen, if you want to find me where I share my stories, go to @RichardA.Fowler. One of my secret passions, Hunter, is that I'm a total, where I find safety and I find joy is in cooking and in food. And so every Thursday on my, I got to find it somewhere, right? So every Thursday on my Instagram channel, you'll find Tasty Thursdays, where I literally show you something that I cooked in my kitchen. which is where I find my joy. So definitely check out my Instagram page at Richard A. Fowler, and let's cook together, and let's actually share stories together too. Let's do that.
I would love that, and I like how you're elevating Thirsty Thursdays to Tasty Thursdays. So good on you, Richard. Welcome.
Thank you, Hunter.
Thank you. I hope to see you again. I'll reach out.
For sure. Take care. Happy Pride.
Thank you. You too.